My name's Niels Crombrey. I'm a sales engineer with LogPoint in the UK. The purpose of this hour is to go through the LogPoint solution, kind of architecturally, as well as in terms of the functionality that it hopefully gives you, a bit about the company, and then also a demo. There's a particular focus on the user entity behavioral analytics, the machine learning abilities of LogPoint, but equally there will hopefully be enough information on the core SIEM solution as well, if that's what interests you. I'll go through some slides first. I'll get to the demo at the end. In terms of what we're talking about in general, the reason why people are looking at SIEMs is this general problem that the industry is trying to address, which is the time it takes to detect a threat versus the time it took to compromise an environment. Especially when we're talking about things like zero-day attacks. They can happen rather swiftly, and it still takes weeks, if not months, for most customers and organizations to detect that something happened, which of course leads to all sorts of problems, especially when it comes to things like breach notification, as well as just working out what the damage was. So that is the traditional use case for a SIEM solution. Having a SIEM obviously comes with a lot of other benefits, but surely collecting your log files and having a repository of them that you can hopefully search through quickly will help narrow that gap, and it will also help you do some more activity proactively. So maybe finding these things before they reach the full extent, whether that's malware, whether that's data theft, and ultimately alerting on that as well as a kind of defensive measure. So that's the traditional SIEM use case. But ultimately, a SIEM is really just a big data platform. So you're putting a lot of data into it, and then you can run all sorts of analytics on it, whether that's dashboards and reports, or whether that's alerts, whether that's just kind of intelligence you gather from that. It's obviously born out of the cybersecurity space. And then adjacent to that is compliance and operations. Compliance being able to prove that you can identify these things as they occur, maybe to an auditor, maybe there's a requirement for a certain certification about log management, but also operationally, knowing what goes on in your environment helps in order to understand, uptime, server availability, network traffic through NetFlow data, all sorts of other things that are really useful in IT that might or might not be related to security. And then lastly, an area that we see more and more is that ultimately we can process any data. So if you have applications and databases, or you have custom applications even, you might have some kind of CRM system, all sorts of tools that they generally all write logs, and you can add those to your SIEM. And then maybe you get insight about your order status, or your patient data, and all those kind of things. So ultimately the tool set is the same. It's just a matter of the data that you put in and who the people are that look at that data at the end. About LogPoint, briefly, if you haven't heard much about us, that could be because we are a European company, and as far as I know, we're the only European SIEM vendor. We have been around for pretty much a decade, but it started in Scandinavia and has grown out from that. We like to consider ourselves a next-gen SIEM, or a modern SIEM, as Gartner now calls it, for a variety of reasons that I come to when we come to the architecture. I won't go through all of these boxes. We are EAL3+ certified, which again I think is the only SIEM solution that is at the moment. That isn't that relevant to most customers, but it means that we are written in a secure way that has been externally certified, and that means that we can deploy the software in secure environments. And I guess the only other point to make out of most of these boxes is that our customers generally really like us. That's reflected both in the renewal rate as well as in the satisfaction rate of customer support. And if you do want to read about what other people are saying about LogPoint, other than references, feel free to take a look at Gartner's Peer Insights. That's kind of a relative of the Magic Quadrant. My colleague always calls it the TripAdvisor of software. So there you can get real customer testimony that they've uploaded recommended and rated software with. And feel free to read that. Hopefully you'll find lots of good stuff about LogPoint, and by all means compare it to the competition as well. So what makes us different is threefold, really. There's obviously more differences there, but I think one big thing about LogPoint as a SIEM is our aim to make SIEM more accessible and simpler for everyone to use. SIEMs have a bit of a reputation, especially kind of older SIEMs, that they're complicated to deploy, complicated architectures, need whole security teams to look after them, which then leads to lots of people to assume that it's really expensive, and therefore we don't even have to bother with that. We try to change that, and there's lots of ways in which we're trying to change that. The architecture is one of them, the user interface is another, and then also the license model that I might come back to is kind of the third element of that. So most SIEM solutions are somehow based on the amount of data that you're either ingesting in the platform or that is kind of arriving on your doorstep, whether that's events per second or gigabytes per day. There's lots of different ways of doing that, but it's all related to the amount of data that you process. And that's not the case for LogPoint. We license on the number of devices that you're logging data from. That might not sound like much, but it certainly means that you have more visibility and predictability of your license cost, even going forward. If you make an acquisition or something like that, you know how many boxes you bring in, you know how much that SIEM license would cost. But also, as we all know, data keeps growing, and that's certainly true for log messages. If your machine starts logging more information, that's technically really good. Because it gives us more information to work with. But with lots of other SIEM solutions, you're then worried about how much is that going to cost me, and you're artificially limiting what you actually send from each machine, just so that you don't have to pay for that. And that's not great for visibility and security and all those kind of things. So as I said, for us, it's always based on the number of devices. And lastly, our support, I've mentioned it to a certain extent, but it goes further than what most other software vendors would do. It's not just about patches and keeping the lights on. It's also about giving you value out of the platform and making you use it, because we don't want that solution to sit in a corner, because then that probably means you won't renew. So there's a vested interest for us, and it also means that you hopefully get some value out of it. So that goes as far as maybe creating a dashboard for you if you can't do it yourself, or you have a specific query where you want to correlate two devices and don't quite know how to work that out. You can raise a support case and we do that for you. Hopefully that will then slowly give you the ability to do it yourself, but it certainly should mean that you can address certain use cases that you actually want to address with a SIEM, rather than it just being a lock bucket in a corner. So this is another element of support, and this is an important point for any SIEM, and in fact often where most of the work comes in when the setup happens, because a lot of this is outside of the SIEM itself. It's about bringing in your data sources, and there's a couple of common ones, certainly anything to do with network, switches, firewalls, VPNs, all that kind of stuff. You want to bring in as a source into the SIEM platform. And it goes beyond that. Active Directory is usually another one, or any kind of user authentication, and then maybe antivirus, spam filters, email traffic, up to databases, door control systems, whatever else it might be. When these sources arrive on our doorstep, we normalize them. And what that means is that we take these log messages that all look very different and translate them into a single LogPoint language. And that is a lot of what the value of a SIEM is. So suddenly you have all these log messages that otherwise sit on lots of different boxes that you have to traverse if you want to find anything out, in one platform and easily searchable and accessible at your fingertips. And that means that you can now not only look at what has happened, but proactively keep an eye on these things. Maybe it alerts you, or you have dashboards that tell you certain things that otherwise would be hidden in some log message somewhere. And the normalization is important because these log messages look different, and therefore it's often very difficult to kind of piece them together. And maybe find things that happened on the firewall followed by something happening on Active Directory. By normalizing them and putting them in the same format, you can search through all of that at the same time and cross-reference between that. So that's what we mean by normalization. We do that with something we call vendor packages. that come with the product. It says here 400, it's probably even more than that now, for all sorts of different vendors. And the gray stuff in the background here isn't the complete list, and there's more that we don't have listed there. And that's usually at least the logic to understand the logs, but most often also dashboards and maybe sample reports and maybe some sample alerts. So that is one of the differences to other SIEM vendors. So you get something out of the box, at least to give you some value, and then obviously over time you can customize that to what matters most to you. And if we don't support something, which does happen, either we haven't seen it before, it's a new vendor, or they have changed their version and the log messages have changed, that is part of support. So you just tell us, I have this new device that I really like to see in the SIEM platform. Here's some example log files. Please normalize these for me. And we usually turn that around in a few days, and then you get a package that normalizes those logs. And very specific, you might even get a dashboard from us and so on as well. So that's how we are addressing one of the advantages some of the larger competitors have, where they have a huge user base that does that for them. So you might see that these app stores that some vendors have. They are usually written by the community, which then leads to various degrees of quality, and we just do it through our support. And that's why it's important to highlight that. So architecturally, the way that works then is that these sources, you see some examples here, arrive at the doorstep of LogPoint. And then there is a set of roles that LogPoint performs to normalize and store and search that data. There's this yellow box there, that's essentially part of the basic SIEM license. And what you get from us is essentially one single machine image. Or indeed an ISO, and that deploys one or more of these nodes that take one or more of these roles. So there's no specific operating system that you need to set up. There's no database dependency. It's all one self-contained image. Ultimately runs on a hardened Ubuntu underneath, but you don't really need to know that. You then deploy one or more of these. Some customers only have one box that does all three of these. Some customers have tens or hundreds of boxes in all sorts of locations and spread this out. It scales really nicely horizontally, depending on how much data you throw at us. So the collector is responsible for this normalization. It can also do something called enrichment, which is looking up other data sources and correlating that against the log. So one good example of that is Active Directory. If you have a log that comes in with just a SID or just a user ID of some description, we can enrich that by looking up Active Directory and maybe putting in their email address and the location and department of that user that performed that activity. We have some customers that look up MAC addresses as they appear in the firewalls against their asset management database and work out, okay, so this MAC address is from this MAC and it is on the 3rd floor and belongs to Bob. And you can have that in the log and then analyze on that basis as well. So that's really useful. And then it gets routed to one of these data nodes. And they are really the ones that store the data. It's a flat file infrastructure underneath, so there's no big SQL database that holds all this stuff. And that's why it scales so well. There's also some storage tiering built in. So if you decide you want to store your logs on fast, expensive storage for 30 days, because that's where most of your searches are, and then you want to automatically move it onto a cheaper, maybe a remote mounted storage tier, those data nodes do that automatically for you. And lastly, there's the search head, which is the web interface that potentially spreads out these search queries across the data nodes and then collects all the results again to visualize. So that's the base core SIEM functionality. And again, it's worth reiterating that that's not reflected in licensing at all. So it doesn't matter whether you have one of these or hundreds of these, the license model is the same. It's the sources that come in that you pay for. That means that you can, after the fact, if you decide, oh, in this remote location, we really want to keep some local data, or, oh, there's a lot of data that now happens here, let's stand up another collector, you can do that without actually having to pay any more money for it. In addition to that, there's a few extra components that I wanted to mention, specifically UEBA, because that's one of the subjects that we're going to talk about today. So firstly, just to complete that yellow box, there is actually a component called Director. That's mostly used by our managed service providers to manage multiple different LogPoint environments that are completely separate. Technically, it's part of the base license, so you could deploy that if you wanted to. Some big global corporations do that if they have multiple LogPoint instances, maybe in Japan and America and whatever else it might be. But generally, there is role-based access and kind of split out by different repositories and so on available in a single LogPoint collector, so you obviously don't have to do that most times. The other thing I wanted to mention, because it's a bit of a buzzword at the moment, is security orchestration, automation, and response. So that is essentially the nirvana of SIEMs. If you have all this information in the SIEM and you have all these alerts in the SIEM, why not take action from the SIEM? And we don't do that ourselves, but there are third-party vendors out there, such as DF Labs, that we work with and integrate with, that can create these entire run books of what needs to happen when a breach is detected and so on. Although we do find that those solutions are very much priced on the assumption that you can remove some headcount, and it is quite expensive, but it is available if you need it. UEBA, however, is a function that's very much part of LogPoint, and you hopefully see that in the demo, how it's integrated, and that's the machine learning-based behavioral analytics. And you see the magic word there, cloud. Everything I've talked about so far is commonly deployed on-premise. People most often stand up one or more virtual machines in their VM environment. Sometimes they deploy it on hardware, and sometimes they deploy the machine images directly in Azure or AWS. They're available there too, but it's then often in hybrid environments where there's still an on-prem component. UEBA is different in that we run the analytics for you in our data center, which is in Denmark. So that means that the data is analyzed up there, and you don't have to have any separate setup for that. It's just a question of another license. But even though it's in the cloud, the data actually gets encrypted and hashed on-premise with a key that only your LogPoint box holds. So what leaves your perimeter is encrypted and hashed data that we cannot reassemble to anything meaningful. It is enough, however, to run those machine learning models on. And then once the results are out from that, we send those back, and it gets essentially decrypted and personalized again when it hits your LogPoint box. So even though it's a cloud service, the data is actually still yours. As I mentioned, there is a separate license for that one, which is pretty much the only other license that we sell. That's the machine learning on top. That's also licensed by the number of devices, but also by the number of users that you might be analyzing with that. It's called an entity, really. That is something that you would purchase separately. There's obviously bundles and so on available, and that runs the machine learning on top of your core SIEM. So I've mentioned UEBA a few times. I will show you most of that in the demo, but just to kind of set the scene a little bit, what we're trying to address with UEBA, and there's actually other interesting stuff coming on that front, is essentially that picture on the right-hand side, which I always find very fitting. As I mentioned, one of the reasons that SIEMs have a bit of a reputation is because people are concerned that they don't have the manpower to actually manage that. There are ways of dealing with that by running service providers and so on that might take some of that off. And we also like to think that LogPoint isn't actually complicated to use. And hopefully there are some things that save you a lot of time that then free up time to actually do some meaningful work. But we also appreciate that there's a lot of kind of knowledge involved in order to do that. And even if you have the time, you might not have the skill set to anticipate the types of alerts and events that you want to be informed about. So UEBA is there to give you another helping hand and identify patterns in your logs that you otherwise wouldn't recognize because you don't know that you're looking for that. And that's really there to address that problem that we all know that we're busy, and we don't want SIEM to be another tool that sits in the corner and everyone's scared to look at because it might tell them something uncomfortable. So that's really where UEBA comes in. And what it does is look at the behavior of your entities and your users over a certain period of time and create a baseline of that, and then determines how far removed behavior is from that. And it does that with machine learning models that all belong into one of these categories, which are the stages of a cyber attack. because those cyber attacks do leave traces behind. Unfortunately, they're not as simple anymore as my firewall has been breached and therefore I'm under attack. It's usually something that happens over a period of time, and it happens in multiple different locations very slowly. So you'd have to know what you're looking for and tie all of these things together manually if you didn't have something like UBA. Whereas UBA realizes there's a lot of things going on that don't quite fit the norm, and it might then tell you about it. And I'll show you how that works in practice. The other point to make, and that's true for LogPoint in general, as I hope I've already alluded to, as well as UBA, is that you can get something going relatively quickly. So both the SIEM deployment as well as the UBA deployment doesn't have to be a month-long drawn-out process. We do have customers that get this up and running and value from it in about a week. So we do that by these pre-bundled vendor packages. And also UBA, as I mentioned, because it's run in the cloud, can really be enabled by enabling a license key and then uploading the data. UBA, also still a relatively new technology, used to come with a lot of professional services days just to map your UBA against your SIEM solution and mapping the fields across. And that is pretty much a waste of time. We don't have that problem because firstly, it's all from one vendor, and secondly, because we have normalized these logs, they all look the same to us. So we don't need a UBA for a Cisco device and then a UBA for a Palo Alto device and so on. We just do it on our normalized logs, which makes it easy to set up, and it makes it easier to for us to maintain. And by having it in the cloud, you also don't have to worry about how much resource will I need for that, which is notoriously difficult to predict. And that was it in terms of slideware. Hopefully that's given you a bit of an overview. I will switch to my demo environment. So what you see here is the LogPoint user interface. It's driven through the web, through a web GUI. It's nicely responsive, HTML5 and so on. And you see the basic functionality of a SIEM up here at the top. So there's these tabs, which are essentially what you'd expect. There's dashboard views, searches, reports, and so on. I'll come to them in a second. And then there's also these dashboards themselves. Again, I'll come to the other ones in a second. But the one that you see here is the machine learning dashboard. This is kind of the end result once you've done all your homework in your SIEM. This is the machine learning that looks at your log messages that have been ingested in your platform. So you can see that we've ingested 120 million events that we have analyzed against these machine learning models. Out of those many, many logs, we found 2,590 anomalies, i.e. things that are a bit out of the norm, which ultimately leads to currently 3 entities that we consider risky. And you can see down here, this is the development of those scores in those different models that I had mentioned earlier. And they fall into these categories. So they show up in different behaviors and in different log sources. You can see how that's kind of broken down over time. So what happens when we look at the timeline here, and this is for a specific day, is that you can see there's been certain activity during the day, some considered low risk, some considered high risk. And then on the left-hand side, you have the users that performed this activity and a certain risk score assigned to them. These risk scores are always based on 1 to 100. And unlike some other vendors, it's not us expertly creating scores for certain activity. This is truly based on the machine learning and how far removed their activity was from what is considered the norm, both in terms of what they themselves usually do, as well as in what other users in the environment usually do. And you can see that there's one user that stands out. I can filter just on that high risk rating, and there is Joshua left over. And you can see the timeline of events here on the right-hand side as to what happened. And if I take you through those individual things, that also explains the concept between UBA quite well. So if I look at this, this is a model for the working hour of Joshua, or indeed the time the activity that he performs takes place. So there's a fan of activity here of what he normally does and when he does it. So in this case, it's kind of in the afternoonish. But also, this is the activity that just happened, and it was like 7 o'clock in the morning, which for Joshua is unusual. The reason why UBA is really useful here is because this would be notoriously difficult to create as a traditional SIEM alert. You might be able to create a rule: if anyone doesn't work between 9 and 5, then let me know. But as we can see here, Joshua is already one of those cases that would then lead to these dreaded false positives, because he is a bit of a night shift worker or a late worker for whatever reason. So for Joshua, his normal time is actually in the evening. If you had this static rule 9 to 5, then you would have alerts every Monday morning, which is the point we're making about any kind of alert in a SIEM. What we don't want is this alert fatigue where no one looks at the SIEM because it's full of alerts that don't mean anything. We usually advise to create alerts that are meaningful, and when they do get triggered, you know what to do. What's the point of having an alert if it's just there to look pretty? The UBA alert obviously can take this machine learning into account as to what his normal behavior is. Also, the other reason why this might be a bad alert to create in a normal SIEM is because he might just be on holiday, or he might be a bit sleepless and works in the morning for once. So you can't really create a binary alert on this that goes off every time someone does this, especially in a bigger environment. It probably happens all the time. What it does mean, though, is that his risk score is slightly elevated because it is unusual for him. And if he doesn't do anything else that's unusual, it probably doesn't warrant an alert. But as we can see in the timeline, an hour later, there's this, for example, happening, which comes from a completely different log source. And that's the other advantage of a SIEM versus maybe some network tools. This comes from the web proxy. And we see that in the log message. Joshua has sent 1.3 gigabytes using a post request, which is a very strange way of posting that much data. And it is a strange way of doing it, as we can see from his previous behavior. He might be uploading a cat photo or something on his webmail account, maybe the year-end presentation, but he never transfers that much data in this way. And it's also true for our other users. They don't do that either. So you can see how far removed from the norm this activity is. This may indicate data theft, and that will have significantly ramped up his risk score. And that's how these risk scores are arrived at. It's not just a singular event, it's a sequence of things across multiple log sources where that behavior falls out of the norm. Which then means it's actually relatively easy to create alerts on this because it's less likely that there's a false positive. There might well be 1 or 2 false positives in there, but a whole sequence of events, all considered risky that way, is actually relatively unusual. And because there's these hundreds of models that do this, it can do that for things that you might never think about, or indeed might not be able to define yourself, as I've just explained. This also works for other points of use. So for example, I could look at it from a perspective of shares, and there's one share now that's considered relatively risky. It is because Joshua Newman had his fingers in the pie again, but he accessed that share 38 times in an hour, and at most he normally does 2 times an hour. So you can see how that kind of works for all sorts of data sources. We do things like email traffic. Suddenly he's emailing someone that no one in the company has ever emailed before and has attached lots of data to that, and other bits like that. You can look at it from a perspective of servers, and you can see if there's people that have an unusual amount of failed login activity. So in this case, it's all fairly benign, but you can see the type of models that run. Suddenly has lots of failed login attempts on this machine, and he only had 1 day with failed login attempts. In itself, not a problem, but suddenly if 20 users try logging into a server that they've never tried logging into before, maybe something's going on. So that's the basic idea behind UEBA. It's trying to find these unknown unknowns, these behavioral patterns that might be present in the logs, but are really difficult to spot unless you know what you're looking for. Obviously, for all of that to work, you need to have the basic SIEM in place. And there's a lot of value you can get out of a regular SIEM without maybe having to go to the lengths of UBA. If I go back to those dashboards that you see here at the top, that's usually the first thing customers want to do. If we look at something like this, this is a visualization of the networking logs that we bring in, which is one of those traditional data sources. There's not much going on in this environment, but you can see from the firewall how it reports to us what it's denying in terms of sources and destinations. Maybe this is also interesting, deny connections between different zones. That's obviously something that you can define in the platform relatively easily. And often a SIEM is about finding things that you think shouldn't happen, but still show up in a log somewhere. So this is a prime example. You might be expecting your firewall to block this, but if you see traffic like that between different zones, maybe you want to know about it because the configuration went wrong somewhere. So that's kind of basic networking, which both has a security angle as well as an operational one. And it can go as far as I said, NetFlow data, if you want to know what are your links and how much data do they send. And we can take it a step further if we augment it with this threat intelligence. So that's an example of this enrichment that I've talked about, where we're taking third-party feeds, and you see some examples here. Some are free, some are paid for. They're not ours, but they're available from providers. And they are essentially reputation tables of IP addresses and domains that are worldwide known to be malicious. You can see in this case, there is actually some things that got triggered because we see the network traffic through those log files. We can cross-reference that and check, is this IP that we're talking to actually on one of those blacklists? And you can also see that there's a few things in here that may be benign, but the things like a malware compound and control server, maybe you want to know about that. Another point to make here is that this is functionality that sometimes is present in all sorts of other security devices. Maybe your firewalls do something like this themselves. And we're perfectly fine with that. There are some things that you can do in the SIEM, but equally other security tools do that too. You might also have some firewalls that do that, and then maybe others in the organization, a different vendor that doesn't do it. So you can kind of augment that just in the SIEM. Also, if you do have something really fancy, something like Darktrace, for example, or indeed a vulnerability scanner like Nessus or Qualys, you can see here how we can bring that data in. And all of that data is good for a SIEM because we can use that as another dimension of our analysis. So for example, if you have a machine that is known by Qualys to not have been patched, then maybe we put that on a list, and those machines are treated specifically when it comes to alerting. So if you see a machine that does something and is on this list, then maybe you do want to know. But if you know it's patched, then maybe you don't want to know. And that's one way of addressing false positives just in the basic SIEM solution. And you can collate different lists like that from different sources. The second big area is user authentication in all shapes and sizes. So Active Directory, whether that's on-premise or in Office 365/Azure, we can bring that in, and you can get an overview about which accounts are getting created, who's changing what accounts, how is this changing over time. And you can see how sometimes just having a dashboard might tell you something security focused. If you know how these graphs are supposed to look, then suddenly you have a spike where there's lots of users that are added to an admin group, then maybe you know that has gone wrong. All these dashboards come pre-built, but you can move these widgets around and you can kind of resize things and change the way they look. And what most customers end up doing is they create a new dashboard and maybe drag and drop those things in there, maybe one from their firewall, from their Active Directory, and that's the dashboard they look at with the stuff that really matters to them. Another point to make is that all of these things in LogPoint are actually driven by searches. And if we look at one of these, you can see how that search looks behind the scenes. This is how you would investigate things manually, and also how you can make changes to this. So for example, if you want to exclude a certain group of users from this, or you want to have 20 instead of 10, you change the query here, and that dashboard will kind of be updated accordingly. If you want something more than a dashboard, one thing that I really like is what we call search templates. And they are essentially a bit like dashboards, but they are customizable in there's some input that you can add to them. So if we look at this threat hunting one, and I have it, let's do it like this first. I click update. As you can see how that looks like a dashboard, but you have these fields at the right-hand side that you can fill in. So if you want to know specifically, like in this example, what did this user do, and you do update, then you can see, okay, so that's all he did and all that he accessed and all the emails that he sent, and so on and so forth. And that you can do for all sorts of things. Active Directory group management. You want to know which user has been added to a specific group, go to the search template for group management, type in the group name, and then you get the breakdown like that. Or you can build your own. And the idea here is that you might be able, firstly, as I mentioned in the beginning, save yourself a lot of time, something that might have taken a few minutes or an hour to go through Windows logs. Suddenly you can do like this. And also you might be able to give this to someone that isn't even in IT, or certainly not in the security team. So for example, if the HR team needs to check at the end of an employment that the user account has actually been disabled, they could have a dashboard for them that shows them exactly that, when and how that user was disabled, and they can just put in a name and it shows them. And we have customers doing that. So hopefully that will be some time you save, just on the basis that you have it all in one place. And hopefully this will be, if not the last, then one of the last platforms that you need to learn on how to create these reports and so on, rather than every single platform and function having its own reporting solution. If we look at this dashboard, all of these things are driven by searches as well. So they are kind of built in the same way. And I just wanted to show you that if where do I go? Let's do that. So if I search for this, you can always hit the search button on here and it takes you into the search platform behind. So there is a search language to it, which might look intimidating at first, but it's relatively easy to get your head around. There's a few helpers there in terms of autocomplete and documentation on that. And there's always these sample dashboards, for example, to go back to and work out how these queries are normally built. And then you can hit on these magnifying glasses there and you get a level deeper and it shows you the actual log messages. I just wanted to show you that because it explains a bit what I have been talking about initially. So in this case, this is a Windows event log. And you can see here that we always see the original log. There are some SIEM solutions out there that actually discard what they don't understand. That won't happen here. In worst case, you'll always have this to go through. It's indexed, so you can search through that as a full text search. If you ever question, does it actually show up somewhere, you can always do that. But the second thing that we've done is we've translated that into this LogPoint language, which is what you see at the top here in blue. These fields are always the same. There are obviously bits that are specific to Windows, but something like a domain or a workstation or an event source will always be the same, no matter what log source it came from, which then makes it much easier to search through all of them at the same time. And this is then what you can search for. You can do simple things like message equals whatever, and then you kind of like that, and that is a search. And it's always these key value pairs. So it could be source underscore address equals 1.1.1, and then you search for that. And the other thing that we've done, you can see that here, if we understand this message, and Windows ones we generally do, there's quite a few others that we understand too, we add these labels to them. And especially in the case of Windows, that's really useful because there's probably, there it is, an event ID hidden somewhere, 4720, which some people know by heart, but I don't. But by having these labels, you can work out, okay, so this log message, I don't need to look at any of this, is someone created a user account. And if I search for a few other log messages, let me see, yeah, so this one, no, that's Windows 2. Is there anything that isn't Windows? No, not at the moment. Oh, there we go. That's a syslog message. Came in also from Windows in a different way, but you can see how that's kind of a different log format that we then unravel. These fields on the left-hand side are kind of shortcuts for you to work out what's in these log results. By the way, if you hadn't noticed, this just brought back 542,000 logs. Which is the other big time saver that kind of, it crunches through them in no time really. Obviously you wouldn't know what's in this, but you can see that for object, for example, there's 53 different values that come up for object in this result. So if I click on that, you quickly get a breakdown of what the things were that happened in here. Same if we look at domain, these were the different domains that we saw in those log messages. So that's a nice way of dealing with it. There's other things in here. If you have something like this, you can do things like a DNS lookup or a whois. That makes more sense for external addresses, but and you can kind of filter down from these logs. So that's how you would be working interactively with the log messages and maybe creating your own dashboards and searches. Once you have done that, maybe created something, I have this broken down by domain now, you can actually take this and turn it straight back into a widget on the dashboard, if that's something that you want to have in front of you all the time. Or indeed, if it's something very specific and you know, all right, if that happens again, I need to know about it, you can create an alert rule from that too. So that would be the next thing to look at. The alerts are, again, just searches. Oops, it's here. And there are alerts that are pre-built. As I said, you wouldn't want to turn on 20 pages worth of alerts. So this is actually a relatively good example because there's only very specific alerts that are enabled. You'll see here some that are driven by UEBA. UEBA is just another data source. So the alerts are defined in the same way, but rather than looking for something very specific, you can say, if UEBA risk score is larger than 80, please let me know, which is probably a pretty good sign that something's going on. But equally, if you have something very specific, there's quite a few that come with a Windows package as an example. If you want to be notified if someone copies something to removable storage, this is the search for it. If there's write data to removable storage, then let me know. There's a bit of throttling that you can turn on. For example, this one, you can say if the user field doesn't change, please don't let me know again within 3 hours. And that's one way of dealing with false positives, or indeed with a kind of lots of repetitive alerts if someone copies hundreds of files. Obviously, you wouldn't want to turn this on as generically as that. You'd be notified every time someone copies something to a USB stick. But you could do it for specific groups of users or machines, maybe those ones that the vulnerability scanner has identified, or maybe something for users that have a relatively high risk score from UBA, or all sorts of other criteria, and make it a bit more specific than that. And then those alerts can be quite useful. Once they get triggered, they can lead to certain notifications. If we look at one of those, there's different methods that it can notify through. The most common one is still being email. That often is used to actually raise tickets, maybe in ServiceNow or something, and then the tier 1 analyst looks at it. But you can raise your own syslog notifications, your own SNMP notifications, and even kind of more active ones like a get and put on a REST API, or indeed running a script. So that would be the first step towards kind of automation. But obviously that script would still have to be written by yourself. We do have some customers that tune their spam filter on the basis on how much kind of log data they get and so on. Then it leads to an incident that's managed in the platform. Again, not everyone uses this. Some people use a ticketing system outside of LogPoint. You can have rules as to which user in LogPoint this goes to. You can escalate and reassign and close and comment. And the other nice thing is that you can always click on view data, and it takes you straight to the log messages that trigger that. In this case, this is probably a while back, so it doesn't find it. But you can get to the log data itself, which is really helpful in the kind of notifications here, so you can work with that. And then last but not least, reports are just another iteration of this. And again, sometimes there's platforms where the report is really complicated to create. Sometimes there's external modules and all sorts. With LogPoint, it's all nicely built in. So if we look at something like this, there's usually two categories of reports. So one is the ones that come with the devices. They're fairly network specific, device specific. If we look at one of them, they are what you'd expect. They are kind of, there's look and feel that you can change. There's a bit of a text blurb, and then it's essentially the breakdown like in the platforms, in the dashboards, but broken down in a report that you can schedule and send to people. And then the other one is a compliance package that comes with LogPoint, which is more regulation specific, tying it to specific regulation like GDPR. If we look at that, and there's a bit of a blurb around that as to why this matters for GDPR and kind of what the regulation says about it and so on. I wouldn't claim to make you GDPR compliant just by running a report like that, obviously, but there are examples of what other customers might ask for and what we've done for them, and maybe you can customize them and get some value out of it without having to build this from scratch. If we look at how those templates are defined, there is a little so essentially, firstly, it's a sequence of searches. So these searches could come from the search dashboard. And in fact, if you click here, you have your search history. So the ones that I've just done earlier, you just click on it and you have it in the report. and you can join them and change them as you wish. And then also, if you look at the layout, there's a little like layout engine in here that looks a bit like a CMS. So you can arrange your little blocks around. You can say, okay, I want 2 more panels, and I want this in this width, and then I want this in there, and so on. And that's how you build your report. So it's really nice and easy. And it means that rather than maybe logging in every 5 minutes and staring at a dashboard, you can proactively be told about this. I had a customer this morning. They wanted to know how their migration is going from on-premise AD to Office 365, and they just created a report that has this time trend where they can see more accounts in Office 365 and fewer accounts in AD, and therefore they know this is going the way they want it to. That's a kind of a very simple operational use case, but they can send that to their management team and say, yep, this migration is in hand, and here you can see how far we've gotten last week. That's really the idea behind the reports. And I think that's all I had at this stage. I appreciate we're a bit early. I hope no one minds. And I also hope that this was useful to give you an idea of both us as a company, as well as the product and the different use cases that we can hopefully address for you. If you have any further questions, feel free to let me know now, and otherwise you will have contact details from the invitations and also at our website where you can get in touch with us for your respective regions.